Welcome, fight fans, to another episode of BTR Boxing Podcast. And today, I'm really honoured to bring to you a true boxing historian, a true martyr of the sport, someone who has wrote a total of 6 books and is here to tell us all about them books, and he's here to tell us about Cleveland's boxing history, known for many great fighters over the years. I'd like to welcome Jerry Fitch onto the show. Jerry, thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to me.
Well, my pleasure. I'm glad to be here. Cleveland boxing, I was very fortunate. During the 1950s, when boxing started being saturated on television, I don't know when we got our first television. I believe maybe 1951, somewhere around there. But that's around the time when there was the Friday night fights and the Saturday night fights and then the Wednesday night fights. And they were, and the irony of it was I was very young. And so naturally I was in school and I normally wasn't able to stay up late, but of course on Fridays or Saturdays, I was different. Now my father was not a big boxing fan. He was not a big boxing fan, yet there wasn't a lot of things on television in those early days. There was a few local shows. There was, there was boxing and wrestling and a few other things. So it wasn't like now where you could select hundreds of channels and, watch whatever. So my dad did watch some boxing. And what happened was I saw snippets of fights. I was very young. I didn't know much about it, but one day we were watching the TV, and ironically, my father says to me, "You see that guy there? Which one?" And he pointed. He said, "During the war, when Joe Louis was in the Army, I must have known who Joe Louis was. I must have heard my father or, my grandfathers or somebody talking about, the greats. Because at that stage in my life, this was coming up on around the time, probably just before Marciano won the title. I'm going to be 75 years old in October, so that'll give you a little focal point. So anyhow, Jimmy Bivens was fighting, and I don't even remember who it was. But I saw him, and then the next thing I saw on one of these fights was Kid Gavilan fighting Chuck Davey. And the one thing I remember about that was one guy was black and one guy was white, but Davey ended up outside literally through the ropes in one particular part of that fight there. So I remembered that. So fast forward a few years, we moved from the west side of Cleveland to a suburb, not far away at all. In fact, we were just across the border. It was a suburb called Parma, kind of the same name as Parma in Italy. And we moved there in 1956. And in 1957, one of my new friends and his older brother, they were going to a fight at the Cleveland Arena. And somehow they had an extra ticket, and, that was probably the furthest thing from my mind, going to watch a fight at that time, even though I had a little bit of interest. So long story short, I went with them, and it turned out to be Carmen Basilio defending his welterweight title against Johnny Saxton, their third fight. And our seats were, way up. It wasn't like we were sitting ringside, but the fight was over in 2 rounds, but that kind of got me hooked. I mean, there I was. At that age, let's see, that fight was in February of 57. So I was coming up on 11 years old. I was 10 years old. Well, anyhow, that got me hooked. Now, Cleveland boxing, the history of Cleveland boxing, we're kind of like most cities in the United States, probably in even different parts of the world, during a period of time where boxing was really frowned upon. In fact, in 1830, it was banned here locally and most places. And so you had fights that they had on the sneak, as they called it. In Cleveland, we were a big manufacturing city and steel mills and that. And down by the lake, there's a place called Whiskey Island. It's an area where the ore boats would unload the ore that would be taken down to the steel mills to make steel. And so fights would go on there, and they'd have lookouts, and then the sheriff would come and people would go running and everybody would scramble. And this is how it went. And then there was a way they got around it. They had some fights in private clubs and in private gyms. The city didn't stop them from that. But basically, the launch of legitimate boxing, even though we had some, we had Kid McCoy and Joe Gans came here and put on an exhibition. There was some big time fighters came here, but the actual launch of real legitimate boxing, where you didn't have to run around hiding from the law, so to speak, was in 1923. The city administration, I don't think we had a mayor then, I think it was another title, but they allowed amateur boxing. And we had an auditorium called Cleveland Public Hall, which still exists, seats about 10,000 or so. It's been used for numerous things, including the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremonies and so forth. But they started amateur fights there, and one of the first Clevelanders of note that boxed there as an amateur was Johnny Risco, who went on to fame, and he was famous and infamous in a lot of ways, but in the pros. In 1924, they finally caved in and allowed legitimate boxing. So, it went from there, and they would have it. We had a lot of different venues then. We had Cleveland Public Hall. We had a couple of armories, the Gray's Armory, which still exists, Central Armory. We had a couple other places which are long gone. And then in 1931, the 20s were going along. We had Johnny Kilbane. We had some really good fighters here locally, and Johnny was the most famous. Of course, he held the featherweight title for 11 years. But in 1931, they built Cleveland Municipal Stadium, which was the rumor was that they were building this to try to get the 1932 Olympics to come to Cleveland, but that's not true, because in 1928, it turned out Los Angeles had already been granted the Olympics for 1932. So that was just one of these urban legends, as they call it, but they built it. And then the first event there ever, July 3rd, was Max Schmeling defended his world title against young Stribling and won by a 15-round knockout. And on the undercard, Johnny Risco, he was a preliminary fighter then. He fought an 8-rounder and defeated Tony Galeno, two-ton Tony. So that stadium was there for big fights, really big fights. Like during World War II, they had, they called it Bombers for MacArthur, for General MacArthur, So they had some big fight shows there, Jimmy Bibbins and Archie Moore and Joey Maxim, and they brought in a lot of fighters. And that stadium stayed there. It's actually sat, I think the seating capacity was over 80,000. It sat there until 1995. It was knocked down, and they built a new stadium for football, our football, gridiron football, not soccer. But the biggest influence to me and the biggest success story in Cleveland boxing, we had early fighters in the 20s, and then when they started the Golden Gloves, we had Olympic champs. We had a couple Olympic champs. We had 1932, Carmen Barth won the middleweight title out in Los Angeles. 1952, Nate Brooks won in flyweight in Helsinki. And we had some others that got, Jackie Wilson got robbed. He only lost one fight. And that was in the 36 Olympics. He lost, I forget who he lost to, but he won every fight, I think 51 out of 52. So he got a silver medal. We had a couple others that did bronze medals. And the Golden Gloves, which were really big in New York and Chicago and Cleveland. So the Cleveland fighters would go, if they won Cleveland, they would go to Chicago. Usually it was the National Gold Gloves there. And then they also had the National AAU, which some of them went on from Cleveland to Chicago, and then to, well, like when Jimmy Bivens fought in 39 for the National AU, that was in San Francisco. They had it different places, St. Louis and different cities. But Golden Gloves were so big in those days that down at Public Hall, they would have 3 rings set up. There'd be 3 fights going on at the same time. And these guys would fight, to the wee hours of the morning. They would, sometimes they had to fight more than once a night. But it was so popular that even up until the 50s, we had a trainer here in Cleveland called Johnny Papke, not related to Billy Papke, but he was a professional fighter. He had a few fights. In fact, he actually fought Harry Greb. Johnny was really famous for amateur fighters. And later years, he ended up working the corners of many pros. He worked with Jimmy Bivens. He worked with Joey Maxim. He worked with Jimmy Reeves, Chuck Hunter, Georgie Pace. I mean, most of the prominent fighters in the professional ranks out of Cleveland, Lloyd Marshall, he trained them at one time or another, or worked their corners at the very least. But as an amateur trainer, and I believe it was 1952. Now, we had a lot of boxing gyms. Now, if you ask me how many gyms we have now, I'm not even sure. I mean, none of the old ones are around. And there's only a couple that fighting is really dead as a doornail here. The Golden Gloves, here's an example. They have a hard time getting 100 kids to go out for the gloves. Now, in 1952, Johnny Papke, his gym, just his gym alone, he entered over 100 kids from his gym. That's not counting all the other ones. We had a lot of gyms going on, the old Angle gym and the 55th Street gym and whatever. But so amateur fighting was really big. And so as things went into, the late 30s and into the 40s, a lot of really good fighters came out of those Golden Gloves, including Bivens and Maxim and Hunter and Reeves and Georgie Pace and Georgie Toy and Eddie Murata and Tommy Salem. These are a lot of names you won't know, but they all went on to have some excellent pro careers and some decent pro careers. But the thing that really, I think, holds the candle as far as the best venue ever was the Cleveland Arena. Now, the Cleveland Arena was built in November of 1937 for $1.5 million, which I don't know what that would be in today's dollars. The guy that built it, it was for his ice hockey team. They were playing at a small arena on the east side of Cleveland at the time. So they built this, and it sat just under 10,000 for hockey. In later years, when we got basketball, it sat 11,000. But they had crowds as large as 14,000 for a couple of Jimmy Bivens fights there. And the arena was there from 1937 till the last fight there was November 1973. And in 1974, it closed down totally and they knocked it down. And we've had some fights since then, at the old public hall. And we had a Coliseum. It's called the Richfield Coliseum out between Akron and Cleveland, Ohio, where Don King had, that's where Jerry Coetzee won the title from Michael Dokes. And he also had, he had a couple big fights. I mean, he had Roberto Duran on his comeback fight here against Nino Gonzalez, I'm sorry. But the arena from 37 to the last fight in 73 had 162 shows total, over 900 individual fights. Now, that figure would even be greater, except starting in the late 50s and into 1960, there was just boxing was really dying. A lot of people said it was because of the oversaturation of TV. You put it in simple terms, people could sit at home on their couch and watch really good fights and, not have to pay a dime as opposed to going down to arena, Personally, as a guy that got involved in boxing real early and went to a lot of fights, nothing beats, especially when I was covering fights. Sitting ringside watching these fights, that you can't get that feeling on a television. But anyhow, the fights there started dwindling in the late 50s and early 60s, and there wasn't hardly any fights. And then in late 1969, a gentleman named Don Elbaum from Erie, PA, started promoting there. For those that don't know who Don Elbaum is, he's still promoting. He started very young, and he ended up, actually, he's the man that gets credit. Now, you can take this two ways. We won't get into a big topic here about Don King, but he's the one that got Don King started. In November 1973, the arena had no fights since 72. All of 73 it had none until November. Don King, who had just gotten out of prison a short time before, put on a fight card there between Jeff Merritt, who was one of his fighters, and Ron Stander. Now, it said Don King Promotion, but really it was Don Elbaum. Don King didn't know anything about putting on fights, and so Don Elbaum was the matchmaker, and he lined up everything, and it just was Don King's name on the paperwork. And that was the last fight there. But from late 69, Don Elbaum put on 3 fight cards at the arena. The first one being his fighter from Akron, Doyle Baird, who ended up being a real decent middleweight. Had some good fights. In fact, he held Nino Benvenuti to a draw when Benvenuti was champ, but it was a non-title fight. And it was between Doyle Baird and Don Fulmer, Gene's brother. But 70, 71, 72, by the time Don Elbaum was done here in Cleveland, he had promoted 26 fight cards. Kind of was a revival for that brief period of time. Me being in my early 20s then, that's when I started writing, actually. I got in touch with the editor at Boxing Illustrated magazine, Lou Eskin, his name was, and asked if I could send in fight results, So I started out doing that, just sending in, fight results. And anyhow, long story short, that kind of blossomed. I actually wrote for London's Boxing News from 73. I think my last article might have been in there, I want to say 76, 77. It's when Graham Houston was the editor then. In fact, the day I got announced as starting to write for them in 1973, on the very same day, Harry Moen started there, and he ended up eventually being the editor, and he's no longer with us. But I would have in probably twice a month I'd have an article in there. And then I went to all kinds of magazines. I wrote for Ring. I wrote for Boxing Digest. I wrote for Boxing World. A couple others that didn't last long, like World Champion. I wrote for another South Africa Boxing World, which ended up being called just Boxing World. And I wrote for another magazine in England briefly, but just called Boxing. I don't think it lasted real long. I did a few articles for them. But that's before I even thought about writing a book. I mean, you mentioned about my books. I actually wrote my first book was Cleveland's Greatest Fighters of All Time in 2002 by Arcadia Publishing. But I actually wrote 2 versions of that, smaller versions, one in 1980. You'll never find it. Well, you might find it on eBay. And a second version, but these were literally taken to a local printer, printed off a few copies, and this Cleveland's Greatest Fighters of All Time. I don't know if you can see that.
Yep.
Can you see it? Enough light. This basically tells the history of Cleveland boxing, just how it started. It tells the whole thing about the 1800s, who came here, and then it goes into the what I consider the greatest fighters in Cleveland history, in no particular order. And no, those would be Johnny Kilbane, Carl Tremaine and Jack Kidd Wolf, um, Lloyd Marshall, Jimmy Bivens, Joey Maxim, Paul Perone, Georgie Pace. For a lot of reasons, they were the best ones. But then it has a lot of great pictures and bios on a lot of other fighters that ended up being contenders. When I get into conversations with some of these younger people on Facebook, I have to remember who I'm talking to because you got a lot of them that think they know it all, and I'm happy that they're passionate about things, but they don't. When I try to reason with them, it's useless. So I'm kind of backing away because, for example, I'll say so and so. They'll say, not mention names now, but so and so is like one of the greatest. He's the greatest of all time, And then I'll say, well, maybe he's great for his era, but and I try to explain. Well, back then, it's not just a question. It's not just some old guy, meaning me, living in his past. I explained the logistics of boxing back then, how many fighters there were, how hard it was. I mean, guys like even the great ones like Willie Pep and Sugar Ray Robinson, these guys would have 100 fights or more and wouldn't get a shot. Jimmy Bivens never got a shot. But I mean, there was so many. Jimmy Bivens used to tell me when he was fighting, you had the top 10, you always had the top 10 rankings and there was only 8 weight classes most of that time. And eventually they had a junior, middleweight, but I mean, it was mostly 8. And so you had like a top 10. And then he said, then you had the second 10. These guys were really, really good. And then you had a third 10. And it went down the line. And some of these guys, you always had to do is just look at their records. It's just amazing, and yet some of them didn't even crack the top 10. But that's how many fighters there were, just like I said about the Golden Gloves. And, now people ask me when I do give interviews or talks on my books, about what's the reason? Well, I have no absolute reason, but I do know as far as here in America, sports are so different, and I'm not making this into a racial thing, but it's true about the black fighters. Back then, most blacks there wasn't much they could do as far as sport. Even Johnny Kilbane when he fought, here's an Irishman, and there was only like 2 things, especially a guy that small, could do. He could play maybe American baseball, or be a jockey if he was good for horses, or box. Other sports weren't big. I mean, it took years and years before basketball and American football and all these other ones got so huge. So now, like, we have this one school on the east side of Cleveland. It's just like a factory for football players that go to Ohio State University. This guy that's the coach there, he has produced some excellent players, and most of them sign up for what we call the Big Ten. They either go to Ohio State or Michigan University. And a lot of them have made it to the National Football League. Well, there's not too many kids that want to get into boxing. Plus, I think the biggest pitfall in boxing, at least locally, and I can probably in most cities, there are so very few good qualified trainers that know the sport. There's people that want to be, and they're passionate, but it's not like when you have a son in school and he's playing some sport like soccer or football, as you would call it, here in America. Even when my sons were playing, I would volunteer to be like an assistant coach. I didn't really know much about the game, but there was some things I could do. Basically, I stood in the goal and let them shoot at me. But to go and say, oh, I'm going to train this kid in boxing when you never fought, or and let me paraphrase that a little bit about trainers and boxers. I know there's some people have 2 schools of thought. Some think you cannot be possibly be a good trainer if you didn't have a great career as a fighter yourself. And then there's others that think anybody can be a trainer. Well, it's kind of in between. I mean, there's some fighters that became excellent trainers. George Benton's a classic example. Jimmy Bivens trained a lot of not so many pros, but good Golden Glove fighters. And then there's some like, say, Angelo Dundee or even a few others that had little or no actual boxing experience. But like Dundee's a classic example. He was in New York learning under some of the great trainers of all time, Chicky Ferrara, Whitey Bimstein, Freddie Brown, all these great trainers that were in these gyms up in New York. And he was schooled by them. He started out carrying the water bucket, and so, but nowadays there's a handful of trainers, but there's not many. And so, I mean, I don't want to ever be one of these, gloom and doomers that say boxing is going to die, but it's definitely never going to go become huge again. I can't see it. I don't care how many giant Russian heavyweights they send over. It's not, or Ukrainians or whatever they are. They're not knocking them, but there just isn't enough passion and enough people, whether it be boxers or trainers, to do it. I really started souring, and I don't mean that in a mean way, but I was so involved. Okay, I watched some fights, and I got involved with some fights, and I went to fights, and then in the '70s, I became a writer, and I was involved with a boxing gym. Three of us started a boxing gym, and we actually, I don't want to say hired because they were volunteers, but we had some qualified trainers there, produced some real good amateur fighters. And our claim to fame at that gym, which no longer exists, is Roberto Duran trained there for his comeback fight, and Jerry Coetzee trained there for his fight with Michael Dukes, his last couple of weeks there. So that was our glory days as far as the gym. But it's just it's a different thing now, and it's a different sport. And so around the '80s and into the early '90s, I really stopped following it for the most part. I mean, I'm aware of who's fighting, and I'm on Facebook, so I see, but I refrain from, getting into one of these, for lack of a better word, pissing contests with people about the old days and the new days, So my books are basically historic. They're biographical, but they're historic. I mean, Cleveland's greatest. Okay, the second book I put out was my little book on Jimmy Bivens. Now, Jimmy, I can talk about him for hours for the same reason I can talk about a lot of these old timers. But Jimmy, I knew him for over 40 years, and I didn't realize when I was young and started, buying the Ring record book or different record books, I saw his name appear like in records of like Walcott or even Joe Louis or Charles. His name was there, but I didn't have his record. So I knew he had been a real good fighter. They had some articles in the paper, even in his later years. But it wasn't until I met him and started really learning from him and others, and started eventually doing research and talking to. I was fortunate to talk to a lot of his opponents, which he outlived most of them. But I mean, over the years, I met guys like Walcott and Charles and Coley Wallace and several others, Archie Moore, that fought him numerous times, and learned from them too also. And then there's some footage became available. So Jimmy, when I wrote this book, his health was failing by then, but fortunately I had it finished before he passed, and I think he was able to appreciate it. Some of the publicity he got, unfortunately, at his later years was because of a situation with his own daughter and her husband, where he almost died. Are you familiar with that story?
Not so much, no, but obviously I'm familiar
Well,
with Jimmy.
his wife died, and so he was living with his daughter, his only daughter, and her husband, and he kind of disappeared. So it turned out the Cleveland police got a call about another situation. It was I guess you could call it child abuse, because his daughter had several children, and the police actually were coming to check on this youngster, And when they got there, one of the other kids said, "You know who's upstairs?" And long story short, they went upstairs, and Jimmy was laying there with like a light bulb and weighed 110 pounds. He practically was near death. He had been abused and left to die up there. And fortunately, he got rescued, and he lived several more years after that. And he was inducted in more than one Hall of Fame, including the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1999. But that was a sad part of his story. But because of the publicity of that, I think a lot of people started realizing, what he was all about and about his career. And so these Hall of Fames came calling, and he got awards in 1943 when the titles were frozen because of the war. He was recognized as the light heavyweight and the heavyweight duration or interim wartime champ. And in 43, when he won the 15-round decision over Anton Christopheridis, he was supposed to get a championship belt from the NBA, the National Boxing Association, which appears in a lot of records. There was a period of time where you had, even though you only had the minimum amount of weight divisions, you had some fighters were only recognized by the NBA or New York. I remember one time, I think it was Lee Savold was recognized by the British Boxing Board as the heavyweight champ, but he was supposed to get this belt, and he didn't. And fortunately, because of the publicity, and I knew a guy that used to be involved, was one of the head officers of the NBA, and he was down in Florida, and we were able to present Jimmy with that. They had to make a new one, but an NBA duration belt. So he did have some glory much later in life, which he should have had earlier on, because his credentials. I could talk 2 hours. I could talk 2 hours about his credentials. How many, not only the champions he beat, but a lot of people aren't familiar with some of the fighters he was fighting, even late in his career. I have a new book out with co-writer John Respanti called A Few More Rounds. And in it, I do a chapter on Bivens. It says More Jimmy Bivens. And it's things I found out that I didn't even realize when I was writing about him. Like how late in his career, even though he had lost quite a few fights in his later years, he was still ranked in the top 10 in the heavyweights for a long, long time. Even he was ranked as late as 1952. And when he, in 43, when he was ranked number one in the heavyweight and the light heavyweight, that's a shame. I mean, there's circumstances. Obviously, the war was on. I mean, he beat Gus Lesnovich, who was champ at the time, light heavyweight, in a non-title fight. But Joe Louis supposedly had promised him a title fight when they both got out of the service, because Jimmy was in for a while too. And of course, when Joe Louis got out, there was the big thing about wanting a rematch of Billy Conn. And then he also fought Tammy Moriello, who Jimmy had beaten twice. So he didn't get a fair play, but it's really nice to see people realizing how good he was. And when they start talking about underrated fighters or fighters from back then, including what they call the Murderer's Row, yeah. Jimmy and fellow Clevelander Lloyd Marshall are getting their just due from that standpoint. Jimmy never fought overseas. Like Lloyd Marshall came to England, and he also fought in Germany. I mean, I have a beautiful footage of the fight of Lloyd Marshall really beating the heck out of Freddie Mills in 1947, which is kind of ironic because then Mills gets a return match with Lesnovich,
beats him,
and Lloyd goes back home and ends up fighting Ezra Charles, who he had knocked out in 1943, and getting stopped himself. So he never got a whiff of that title either. And after I did the Bivens fight, ironically, 4 of my books were put together by a gentleman named Harry Oddie, who is from Liverpool, but he lives in Auckland, New Zealand. Harry is I believe, I don't know what his official title is in New Zealand, but he's the head man of the amateur boxing down there. But he's also a publisher, and And so he was such a great help to me. The next book I came out with, 50 Years of Fights, Fighters, and Friendships. It's basically my journey through boxing. And there's funny stories in here. I mean, I'm not afraid to even tell embarrassing things. I mean, it talks about my journey through boxing, some of the funny things that happened, and some very funny things did happen. I mean, kind of strange things like I'll tell you just one brief kind of funny chapter. It's called "Don't Worry, Mrs. Cooner, Everything Will Be All Right." There was a young fighter named Dave Cooner that actually trained at our gym. My good friend Don Myers trained him. So after all this training, we decided to take him out to an amateur show and get him his first fight. So he was a good-looking kid, big and strong, kind of like his parents. I don't think wanted him to get his face messed up. So we get him out there. They're sitting ringside, and I'm trying to convince them. I didn't work the corner. Don did, and with this trainer John Giacchetti, who was the uncle of the late Richie Giacchetti, who trained Holmes. Anyhow, I barely get the words out of my mouth that everything's going to be fine. The bell rings, and Dave gets hit by his opponent, and he's face first on the canvas. I mean, flat out. And his mother looks like she's going to have a heart attack. His father, I don't know what was going through his mind. And meanwhile, I have a camera, and I'm snapping pictures. And Dave somehow pulls himself up. This is his first fight, mind you. Grabs the guy and hangs on. The bell rings, and he's saved. By the third round, this guy is out of gas, and Dave knocks him out. Turned out, the trainer, John Giacchetti, was lied to. He was told that this kid only had one fight or might have maybe even had no fights. Turned out that kid didn't make it. So the kid that they put in with him was, he had been in prison, and he looked like he had been, when I saw him, I went, wait a minute, this guy looks older, and he's scarred up, and he had like 7 fights. So anyhow, Don and I joked years later that when Dave went down and he was flat out and his feet were sticking up, we could have sold advertising on the bottom of his shoes, eat at Joe's or something. We never thought he was going to get up. But, there was a lot of funny stories, including some ironic things. I have a chapter there called From a Pub Crawl to Wembley Arena. I went on my first trip to Europe in 1970 by myself. A friend was supposed to go with me, and last minute he changed his mind. I decided I'm going anyhow. Always dreamt about going to Europe at the time. Little did I know I was going to go there many times, but that was my first trip. So I was in Germany and Switzerland and Austria and Northern Italy and back to Germany. On the way home, I had a stop off in London for not quite a week. Overall, the whole trip was a little over a month. So I'm in London, staying in the West End, and I'm doing the typical thing that you should do when you're going to pubs. So I'm in this one pub, and everyone was really friendly. Of course, as soon as I started talking, they knew I was a Yank. And this guy, and it's strange because I have a very good memory for names. I mean, my Linda tells me, I don't believe you. I think you're making this up. How could you remember all those things from when you were so little? Well, this guy that I met in the pubs, literally standing across from him, I don't remember his first name, but his last name was Atkinson. And somehow the subject of boxing comes up. And turns out he's going to watch the Chuck Webner, Joe Bugner fight card at Wembley. And he has an extra ticket. Well, this is at the end of my trip. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm lucky I have a room, and they had breakfast, and I'm going around seeing the sights, the typical sights if you go to London for the first time. But I can't afford to be paying for like a boxing tickets. And he says to me, no, mate, it's on me. Or no, he said something about, oh, my mate bombed out, or anyhow, he takes me to the fights. And so that was a horrible fight. I mean, Joe Bugner, who I used to write some very good things about in London Boxing News, he could be very boring, to say the least. And of course, Webner started bleeding, like I think when he walked through into the ring, it was over in 3 rounds. But Alan Rutkin fought, Bunny Sterling fought and won the title. I mean, it was a good card. We were not in great seats, but that was one of the strange things that happened to me over the years. It just like I had other things. I would go to. I was a steel worker, and they would lay us off for a couple of weeks to do repairs, or there was other economic reasons that they weren't getting the steel, the slabs to make the steel. So I had a friend out in Los Angeles, and I would go out what we call the red eye. It was a fairly cheap flight in those days. Los Angeles is about over a 4-hour flight from Cleveland, and I would get tickets for like $200 US at that time. And he had all the connections out there, so I got to go to fights at the Olympic Auditorium and Inglewood Forum, which is now called the Forum. I got to see Ruben Oliveras lose his title to David Poison Cote, and got to see the first Carlos Palomino Muniz fight for the welterweight title. He always had connections, so there's always these fluke things that weren't planned, and I would be in the right place at the right time. I mean, when I went to one of my first fights after that 57 fight, it was in 1964. Joey Giardello was middleweight champ by then. And he was kind of a favorite coming to Cleveland. He fought here about 7 times, never lost. He fought a fighter from Argentina named Rocky Rivero twice in April and May of 1964. At the first fight, I met Rocky Marciano and Rocky Graciano. At intermission, they were sitting down there. And then I also met Joey Giardello. And then the second fight was the first time I met Jimmy Bibbins. I also met Jersey Joe Walcott, Ezra Charles, and Joe Louis. So, being at the place at the right time. And so this whole journey, it got a lot of pictures and things too, but it's just one of these, I'll give you one more example, then I'll get off of this book. New Zealand in 15 Minutes of Fame. 1975, I had been corresponding with some people in New Zealand, and I had a job, and the job got eliminated, and the boss gave me $3,000 US as what they call severance pay. So the smart thing to do would be get another job. Mm-hmm. I was single. I didn't have any obligations to a family, but not me. I wanted to go to New Zealand. I'd heard what a beautiful country it was, and so I did. So I spent a month down there. 2 people that I had been corresponding with, one lived in Wellington and one lived in Auckland. It was just before the Thriller in Manila, the third Ali Fraser fight. They had me lined up because by then I was established somewhat as a writer in magazines. And in fact, I met a couple of people down in New Zealand at some dinners and that, and they said, I read your stuff, Jerry, in Boxing News. I don't agree with you all the time. I said, that's fine. I don't write to, I write what I feel, not trying to please everybody. But anyhow, they lined me up. I ended up being on national television, which I always put a little disclaimer on that saying, yes, it's national television. At that time, New Zealand had 3 million people. So it wasn't like I was on national television in the United States or something. But I was on 3 or 4 radio shows, and they were basically interviewing me and asking me a lot of questions because I had met Ali and Fraser by then. And some of the questions were bizarre, like the one guy on Radio Windy, it was called. He says, you've met Ali and Fraser, and there's a rumor that Ali has come to Manila with his girlfriend and not his wife. What do you think of that? I was like, I don't. What do you want me to think about that? It has nothing to do with the fight. I don't want to get into that, And do you think George Foreman, blah blah blah. So, but it was fun, and that's why I said it's New Zealand in 15 Minutes of Fame. I got invited to the National Amateur Championships in Wellington that year and sat ringside, and met some really good fighters, including a fighter named Boss Murphy, who was the first New Zealander to ever win the then British Empire title. He won the middleweight title in 50 something. I remember off the top of my head there. But anyhow, it was great, and the book was fun, and it really wasn't. It was kind of like a memoir. People that were asking me, they'd say, you saw a lot and you did a lot, and I thought, I don't know if I can do that. Then I wrote this one, which I love, Johnny Risco, the Cleveland Rubber Man. Johnny was born in what is now Slovakia. His family came to Cleveland when he was like 6 years old, and he was just an enigma. That's the only way I can describe it. If you look at his record, he beat guys like Max Baer and Jack Sharkey, and some really good fighters, and then he lost to some bums. I mean, his record was spotty, but he was always in the fight, and he never got stopped until the last fight of his career when Tony Musto stopped him in 3 rounds. But the story isn't just about all these fights. He was such a character, and he was a lovable, funny man. He loved to drive fast. You'd always get speeding tickets, and he ran taverns, bars, pubs, whatever you want to call them. A couple of those buildings still exist. In fact, one still has his name on it, although I went to visit them and they could care less about him. I said, don't you? I was going to give him a poster. This is what this all began. They go, but that's people with boxing nowadays. So a lot of research. A friend of mine works at the Cleveland Public Library, and he's really into research. There's a lot of research put into this book, and there's some good photos, but he is quite a character. And he had a car. There was a place that made 3 different types of cars: Auburns, Cords, and Duesenbergs. And they were really expensive cars. And around the time Henry Ford and some of these other people started mass producing cars, there wasn't too many people were buying these expensive, really classy looking cars. But he had 2 of them. One of them he wrecked, and the other one, it survived. And a guy from Texas contacted me 2 years ago, and he located this vehicle just outside of Cleveland, took it back to Texas and restored it. And he's coming up for a big car show in October, and he wants to get the surviving members of the Risco family, have a gathering and whatever. So that ought to be interesting. Our last book with Harry was called My Favorite Fights. And I always have to explain, or maybe I don't have to explain, maybe I think too much, but this was in 2018. These are my favorite fights. It doesn't say the greatest fights of all time.
Yeah.
They're my favorite fights for various reasons. Quite a few of them I were at, but Aaron Pryor, DeJuan Johnson in Cleveland, because that's the only time I saw, some local ones. I mentioned that Palomino Armando Munez first fight. Of course, the first fight I saw with Basilio and Saxton, but there's others. The Cassius Clay, Doug Jones, Danny Little Red Lopez with Bobby Chacon. The second Patterson Johansson fight, which was so historic. I have two London fights, actually. Freddie Mills and Joey Maxim, and Freddie Mills and Lloyd Marshall. I have footage of both of them, so that's how, not all these fights I saw in person. Of course, Marciano Walcott, that first fight, I just loved that fight. I mean, it was such a terrific fight. And then, Lewis Kahn, Norton Holmes, Ali Chuck Webner. Now, not a great fight necessarily, but I was there, and I lucked out here again. I wasn't in good terms with Don King. That's another story for another day. But the guy that was kind of the PR director for the fight, his name was Jeff Temkin. He's no longer with us. He instead of giving me a regular press pass, he gave me a roving photographer's pass. Now, I don't claim to be a photographer, although I did take a camera and take some. But I was able to move around everywhere. Dressing room, before and after, all around the ring, anywhere I wanted to go, and that was really something. So that's a special memory for me, and it goes on. So I did 25 fights. The first Sugar Ray Leonard, Roberto Duran, that was an amazing fight to me, and of course the first Ali Fraser fight. I rate that fight higher in my own memory and my own thoughts than the third one, because both of them were pretty spent. I mean, they really battled in Manila, but that first one, I never have seen so much publicity, so many famous people. They went to that fight. They were like dressed like they were going to a ball. You know, they were going to the Queen's inauguration or whatever. The nerves. I don't think I was that nervous. You know, I had a few amateur fights, and in sports in general, probably because I never became great in any sport, is because my nerves used to get the better of me. I would try to calm down, and usually whatever sport I was in, once the game started, I'd be okay. But leading up to it, I would almost get sick to my stomach. Well, that night of the first Ali Fraser fight, my knees were chattering, they were clanking. The drama, the whole suspense of it, it was just, I've never felt that, and I've watched a lot of fights and been at a lot of fights, you know. I mean, I've been excited, I've been nervous, and I've been sad, you know, when someone I knew was fighting and fighting the fight of their life, and then with seconds to go in the fight, they get stopped or something, I feel bad, but I never felt like that first one. So the last one, which I mentioned before, a few more rounds. During this whole pandemic, of course, all of us everywhere, or most everywhere, locked down, can't go places, kind of just, well, Linda and I were fine because we've been retired for a long time, but I mean, it's still, I couldn't go. We got a 22-month-old granddaughter, couldn't see her up close. There was a lot of weird things happening and worry and stress, but we were pretty good. But this John Respanti, who lives in California, he's written a couple books, including he and a co-author, Dan Taylor, wrote a trilogy of Gotti and Ward. And he has reviewed my books for different, he has some podcasts he's involved in, Max Box and so forth. And I've reviewed his couple books too. So we knew each other, sort of. And one day while we were chatting online, I don't know how it came up, but we said, you know, I said, I've never did a book with, he did with a co-author. I never have. And I said, it might be kind of neat to do a book, you know, with a co-author. He's younger than me. I'm 74, and I think he just turned 62. So he's a little more involved and still a little bit involved in current boxing. Plus, he started watching boxing a little later than I did, and which carried on to watching it a little later than I did. Also, at the end of his real seriousness of watching boxing. But anyhow, he's a good writer, and we said, why not? And next, you know, we're exchanging ideas, and we actually put this book together. It's by the publisher is it's in Iowa City. It's Win by KO, and the guy that runs that place, he has put out a lot of books, and a lot of other pretty well-known books have come out of there. They do a good job. So basically, John and I did 20 chapters, each did 10, and you know, totally different stories. And then we got Nigel Collins, who used to be the head honcho at several magazines. He was involved with Boxing Illustrated and Ring. He's a Brit, actually, but he's been here a long time. He's a Hall of Famer. He did the foreword for us. But just give you a little brief. I'm watching my time here. I know you got to get going. I did all the fighters I met, over 60 world champions. And one of the first that I ended up being friends with for a very long time was Tony Zale. And though I've had chapters in some, you know, bits and pieces over the years, I never wrote a real lengthy chapter. So that's my first chapter. Then he has one, this is what John has, it's called Dad, Oklahoma, and Cassius Clay / Muhammad Ali. And what this boils down to is his dad was from Chicago, but he got a job in oil, and Oklahoma was still really big in oil then. So they moved there for his job. And young John, it was a bunch of big, tough guys standing around, and they hated Muhammad Ali. You know, they said he was a draft dodger and he, you know, blah, 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 and a Muslim, and it went on and on and on. And John was really crazy about Muhammad Ali. So they started giving him a real hard way to go. And John's father had been a street fighter. Literally, he fought for money on the streets in Chicago growing up. So I guess his nose is making like a left turn or something, and he looks the part. He's Italian. He looks tough anyhow. So he went over, and I guess these guys were suddenly backtracking. They left John alone. But different stories like that. I have one on the Greeks. Anton Christoforidis, who was from Greece and fought in Paris before World War II and then got out of there and came to America and fought and won the NBA light heavyweight title. I met him, and because of him, I ended up making all these friendships and all kinds of things happen, and I'm no more Greek than the man on the moon. But there's different things here. And I think I mentioned earlier, I have one chapter called More Jimmy Bivens. It's some of the things I found out after the fact. So that's number 6, and I'm working on number 7, but I'm kind of a superstitious guy. But it's going to happen because I'm pretty well along, and I can only tell you this, it's going to be with Arcadia Publishing again, which did my first book. In fact, I wanted to mention, I'm not trying to promote anybody's books, but when I put this out in 2002, there was one other, it's called Images of Sports. They're all the same. They're 128 pages with generally sometimes more photos than others. Mine has like 100 photos. There might be some with way more that don't have as much text. The first one was called Detroit Metro Boxing by a guy named Lindy Lindell. And when I saw that, and I had my earlier version of this, I decided to submit it, and thankfully it worked out. It kind of snowballed. I'm not taking credit, and I'm sure Lindy isn't either. But several others came out after this. You have the same kind of format. You have one on New York boxing. You have one on Baltimore, on Boston, on New York, on Chicago, on San Francisco, on Los Angeles. And they're all pretty good, the whole series. And they're still available. I was amazed, because for several years, this book wasn't being printed anymore. And people were asking me, how do I get a copy? And I was out of copies. Well, in 2010, they started a different way of publishing out of Arcadia. So now they print on demand. So it's been selling again. And anytime I need copies, they're available. It's a good situation. They used to say to me, well, if people show interest, we'll print more. And I'd say, well, when I go to a bookstore and I see books, I might look up, oh, this looks interesting. And I pick it off the shelf. And that's how a lot of these. So unless somebody comes into the store and says, hey, do you have that book by Jerry Fitch, Cleveland's greatest fighters of all time? So how do you know if there's demand? I know there's demand because people keep contacting me. So now it's available all the time. So I've been selling these overseas. And I don't know if I mentioned to you or not in one of our exchanges. Out of all these books, and they all end up on Amazon and various bookstores, and I'm not going to bore you or take up more time by listening, but even overseas, for some reason, when Harry would get in touch with me about the sales, how many books were sold, and whatever, the one out of all of them that's sold the most in the UK was Jimmy Bivens, which I thought ironic because, like I say, he never fought overseas, but yet people really have taken an interest in that.
Yeah.
And I'm happy about that. I wish I could have come out with that book 10 years before Jimmy passed. In fact, I wish I would have. I was going to have a follow-up, an expanded version, but it never came to be. And then now I figured, at least I can put a chapter in the new book about, some of the things I learned about Jimmy. One other thing I learned about Jimmy, which out of all 112 pro fights, and he thinks there's even some that end up not in the record book, that it was up to the trainers and managers, whatever, to turn it into to whoever was compiling them, like Ring Magazine was the big thing, but, there was other sources. And, but 112 fights. And besides the champions he beat, which was 8, and all the top contenders, out of all those fights, only 6 of the guys he fought when he met him, had losing records. He wasn't fighting a bunch of stiffs or, even those were in his first year. In fact, I think 3 or 4 were in his first year. You can't say that about a lot of fighters. I look up some fighters' records, and I go, oh my God, this guy, but, so and so and so and so. But look at that record. He was fighting guys with terrible, 1 win, 4 loss, and lots of them. So he was kind of, his first year he beat Charlie Burley. Now, how many times have you or anybody read in recent history about Charlie Burley and where someone hasn't said he's one of the greatest fighters and one of the most underrated fighters of all time, and he rightfully so. But Jimmy started, he won in 1939, he won the welterweight Golden Gloves, and he turned pro as a welterweight, and then he moved into middleweight. Actually, in his first year, in 1940, he was number 9 middleweight in the ring ratings. But he beat Burley in his first year, which was in Pittsburgh. That was quite an accomplishment, And guys that weren't champs. I mean, he beat fellow Clevelander Lloyd Marshall, but he beat so many good fighters. And then they thought he was washed up, and Coley Wallace, who played Joe Louis in the Joe Louis story, he was a decent heavyweight, but they were touting him. And they took Jimmy up to St. Nick's Arena, figuring he's finished. So Jimmy thought he was winning the fight. It turned out he was losing the fight big. In the 9th round, the bell rings. Jimmy goes out, one right hand, flattens Wallace. And after the fight, Wallace attacks him in the dressing room, said he cheated. I mean, the bell had rung. How could you be cheating? But I'm sorry it took so long for me to get online today.
Aye, don't worry, Jerry. Obviously, there's a few questions that I want to ask you really, because and they're probably more quick fire, to be honest with you, because I know like you've had the opportunity to sit and talk through a lot of the stuff that you've been.
Yeah,
involved
I told you I'm long-winded.
Hey, well, this is it. You're telling the story. The thing is, you're telling us a story about where it all began for you, who caught your eye, the types of fighters you've been around. You've mentioned about the career in writing, how that's then blossomed into writing books, and you've mentioned each individual book, so people that are listening and watching can look at these books now and they can purchase them either via like a third party like in Amazon, or obviously they can come direct to you as well and contact you like I've done. Obviously, I've bought all the books from you. I thought, this is something I want in my collection. And you mentioned Jimmy Bivens, and obviously reading up on Jimmy myself, it was like, this is a guy that is, as you rightly pointed out, people say he's very underrated, and there's a reason for that, and it's because of how many future world champions or world champions he would go on to fight, but never get that shot himself. So I found it quite intriguing, and I suppose it was down to a lot of what was going on in the generation at the time. As you mentioned, the Black Murderers Row as well. That's something I've done a lot of research on myself, and you look at all the fighters that were involved in that, and you could even argue Archie Moore was a part of that Black Murder as well, but he was one that actually went on to obviously win titles, but he fought every single one of them in that Black Murder as well, which I found really fascinating.
Archie Moore, as a matter of fact, Archie Moore mentioned that the Black Murderers Row, which an author named Springs Toledo wrote an excellent book on the Murderers Row. I contributed a little bit to that, not much, but a little bit. Archie Moore is quoted in another book where he called Jimmy Bivens. He named a bunch of, but he was naming strictly middleweights, and he called Jimmy Bivens and himself the Black Murderers Row of the middleweights. So even though Jimmy and even Archie are not in that quote, Murderers Row, they had their own little Murderers Row going there for a while.
Yeah, that's true. Right, so as I was saying, there's obviously a few things that I'm sure you've got the answers to directly in your mind when I ask you the questions. But the obvious questions for me that come out of the conversation is, out of all the obviously opportunities you've had to see certain fights live from ringside, because as you said, nothing beats being at ringside to watch them. Just name one particular fight that always jumps out at you when you think of the time that you've spent covering fights at ringside.
Well, if you want me to pin it down to one, I will. just like when I told you about that, my favorite fights, they weren't necessarily the greatest fights,
Yeah.
And when I saw Ruben Oliveira's fight in 1975 in L.A., it certainly wasn't one of the greatest fights because he was not in great shape. It's a memorable fight because a riot broke out and I almost got hit with a chair. But one of the fights that really, as far as if you're strictly talking about ringside, as opposed to television or whatever, a closed circuit. We had a fighter here in Cleveland named Billy Wagner. He fought under the name of Irish Billy Wagner. Local guy, came out of the Golden Gloves. He actually worked at the Plain Dealer, the newspaper where I was working at the time. And he turned pro and he fought as a light heavyweight. And as close as he came, he actually kind of nudged into the top 10 once or twice. But the fight, for whatever reason, and as a writer, you certainly got to be objective and not, take things personal.
Yeah.
Jump up at ringside and start rooting on the. But Billy Wagner there was another fighter named John Griffin, another local light heavyweight, and they didn't like each other. And the first time they fought, Billy, I think he got shut out, really. I mean, he started coming on in the end of the fight. He lost a 10-round unanimous decision. So they had a rematch. It got postponed because Billy had gotten sick or something. The local boxing commission at the time, Cleveland Boxing Commission, was thinking Billy pulled out for other reasons. They started some trouble about it, but it got smoothed over. When they finally fought in February of '72, Billy had a big left hook. He could box a little, but he had a big left hook. And I think, his brother was his trainer and his manager, that's another story. Sometimes that does not work well, family members, leading up to this, he fought Don Fulmer, who, unlike his brother Gene, was a boxer. So leading up to that fight, his brother said, "Oh, we're going to outbox him." Well, hindsight's wonderful. He should have crowded Don Fulmer and just stayed on top of him. Instead, he tried to outbox him and he got shellacked 10 rounds. When he fought John Griffin the second fight, this is one of my, for different reasons, fights. I would have to toss this one and the two Giardello Rivero fights up as my favorite ringside. But Billy fought a different fight this time. They decided to have it 12 rounds. His brother felt the first fight was 10 rounds. If it had gone 12, Billy was coming on strong, that Billy would have won. So they set it for 12. So Billy just takes it to him. He is on top of him. He stays in close. He's throwing body shots. There's no way in the world he can lose this fight. I would keep a running tab. I would keep notes and whatever, because I'm covering it for a magazine or something. And on my scorecard, heading into the last round, I think I had him up 9 rounds. But at the end of the 11th round, it's kind of like that old adage where they always say, always defend yourself at all times. Right near the bell, just about as the bell is ringing, Billy drops his hands and John Griffin hits him with a left hook. And didn't floor him, but he hurt him. So back to the corner, you got the corner working on him, trying to revive him. Seems like he's okay. The bell rings for round 12. And around the 2-minute mark, Billy gets hit with a left hook, goes into the ropes, and goes down. And it was such a terrific fight up to then. Even though he was winning handily, it wasn't like Griffin was letting him have it. They were. Griffin had opened a cut under his left eye, Billy's left eye. It was just a real crowd pleaser. And of course, even though they both were locals, I think Billy was the favorite, fan favorite. he certainly wasn't called a great white hope, but I mean, he had a lot of local following. Plus, I think they had some articles about him more often than not because he drove a truck. He delivered the papers for the newspaper, at the time. So he was well known, and everyone liked him at the writers at the Plain Dealer, which at that time was a big time paper. It was the biggest one in Ohio in circulation. But anyhow, he goes down, he gets up. I think it was 2:01, 2-minute mark, and he just kind of, I guess the referee John Christopher thought, well, he's in bad shape, and he stopped the fight. So John Griffin pulls it out. Terrific fight. It was just, you could have heard a pin drop. So I go into the locker room afterwards, and the doctor's in there looking at Billy. In fact, he's putting a couple stitches in this cut. And Billy is so upset. Why did they stop it? Why did they stop it? And the reason he was upset, obviously losing the fight, because it was a big fight, a step up the ladder possibly. John Griffin had not only beaten him, he had beaten Ray Anderson, who eventually got a title shot with Bob Foster, although he basically ran for 15 rounds. But he had beaten Anderson twice, who was also a local guy. And he had fought John Griffin fought as a substitute against Giant Jack O'Halloran, who was like a mountain next to a molehill, and beat him 10 out of 10 rounds. I mean, just with boxing. He was a good fighter, but Billy was upset that he let everybody down. And I'll never forget that. He wasn't in tears, but he was just so upset. He let everybody down. He let his brother down. He let his wife down. He let the fans down, and eventually he got a shot with Mike Corey in the Garden in New York for the North American, they create these titles, North American light heavyweight title, televised fight. And, I'm biased, of course, a little bit because I knew him, but I thought he won the fight. And when they announced it, it was a draw. And that was Billy's last hurrah. But that fight there, for whatever reason, not only the fight action was great, but the whole parameter about the two fighters, one lived in a really nice, basically white Irish Italian neighborhood in Cleveland. The other lived in what you could almost call the ghetto. Two different kind of upbringings. John Griffin won the national AAU as a light heavyweight 2 years. He was a really good amateur fighter. Billy had just won a local Golden Gloves. I mentioned briefly about the two Giardello Rivero fights. Are you familiar who Russell Peltz is?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not trying to insult you, but Russell is boxing royalty. Yeah. We're the same age. I unfortunately, all the traveling and all the stuff, I never got to attend one of his fights in Philadelphia. But we've known each other for years, and we've had dealings with each other. And we're kind of good friends, even if from a distance. Russell Peltz, he told me, we were talking about the two Giardello Rivero fights, which is where I went up, met all those great champions, those two, in April and May of 1964. They were tough fights. I mean, this Rivero came on like a freight train, and Joey won. The first fight was a split decision, and the second one was unanimous. But they were tough fights, and Joey looked like he had been through a war. This is before he fought Reuben Carter and defended the title. These were two non-title fights. Russell Peltz is under his opinion, and I don't doubt it. He says that those two non-title fights with Rocky Rivero, and I don't even know why they set up two like that, but they did, just took an awful lot out of Joey. Just to show you the people that argue about Reuben Carter claiming he beat Joey Giardello, and he didn't. I watched that fight. I can't tell you how many times over the years. But it just shows you what a terrific fighter Joey Giardello was, because Russell said, those two fights with Rivero really took. I mean, it's like, when you had close to 100 fights and taken a God knows how many punches, sooner or later the accumulation. He was on his last legs, but he boxed beautifully for 15 rounds against Carter, and he was banged up there too. And Joey is banged up in a lot of fights, but when you win 100 or 101, depending whose record book you're looking at, against the fighters he fought, and I was really happy to. I actually saw one other time, 1959. He fought Dick Tiger at the arena and beat him. So, but I've been fortunate, but Cleveland, even if I was still interested in boxing, I'd have to travel somewhere to go see some fights. There's still put a few fights on here and there in California and of course Vegas and a couple other places, but it's really fallen down. It's a shame because I know how I felt when I was young, and how impressed I was, and you get older and you think differently too. Like I never thought about fighters getting hurt, suffering brain damage. It wasn't until years and years later when I started meeting some of these fighters, and I never mentioned names because I don't see the sense of that. To say, oh, I met so and so and he talked like he had marbles in his mouth, or he had a lisp, or he couldn't remember his name. I would never do that to them, but I did get to see more and more of what the damage does, and that's not I'm getting on a soapbox to promote anti-boxing, but I have a different outlook on it. Even when I fought, I didn't have a lot of fights, but one time I did get knocked out one time, and I had a terrible headache for days, and I was in the Army at the time, and so I went to this is before the days of CAT scans and all these, back then the only thing they did for you, X-ray, or they had a thing called brainwave where they literally glued wires to your head, and I didn't have that done, but I had a headache for days, so I go to the doctor on the base, and why do you have a headache? And I told him, I got knocked out. I got the biggest punch of that whole sequence that I remember, or what they told me, was I got hit right in the temple with a left hook, and even though I had a headgear on, I just lost all my equilibrium, and then he hit me with a bunch of other punches, and I went down, and they stopped the fight. But he said he was a doctor and an anti-boxing guy, and he says, he explained to me about your brain rattling up against your skull. I was like, oh, great. Like, if my mother would have heard that, she would have died. Not that I was a sissy or anything, but she I had a bad concussion when I was real young, and she didn't want me to box, put it that way. And so I didn't tell her much about it until after the fact. And I came home one time on what they call leave, and I had suffered a cut. And it healed, but there was a scar. And my mother, so happy to see me. What happened there by your eye? I fell out of bed. I was drunk. No, I didn't say that, but I had to tell her. I had to tell her but by then I had quit. Although years later, when I got home, I got involved with friends of mine, and we started that gym, like I said, and I did spar, and and not terrible battles in the gym or anything, but I had never planned the boxing, but I loved the conditioning part of boxing. I loved doing the road work. I loved skipping rope. I even loved sparring to a degree, but hitting the bags, just all the stuff it was a good training. And I still recommend that part of it for people. They don't ever have to put on fight anybody in a sparring match, but if they go through everything else, it's one of the best trainings, there are. So, to each his own, but like I said, as the years have gone by, I have a little bit different outlook on boxing. Back then I'd watch these fights and blood all over the place and guys getting knocked down numerous times and screaming like everyone else, kill them.
But now it's all changed, and you've got a different perspective on everything now. And you do say it changes as you get older. They're very much right in that. And for me, and for obviously people that have been listening and watching, I think they'll have got a completely different understanding of how things have been throughout the decades, really, for through someone like yourself who's lived through it all. And obviously, you've wrote 6 great books off the back of it. And I think the final thing, really, for the people that are listening and watching, Jerry, is like, if the people do want to buy direct from you, as opposed to going through third party, you know, like, how would they do that? How would they get in touch with you?
I think, I can't rely, I do rely on Facebook. I have my Cleveland boxing site there, and a lot of people have purchased books through that way, even overseas. Cleveland Boxing History is called, but my email address, is certainly the best way. I mean, Jerry, that's with a J, Jerry Fitch, one word, 1946 at gmail.com. That 46 is the year I was born.
Showing your age. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, in more ways than one.
Well, yeah. Well,
one last thing I would say, though, if people listen to this and they say, well, he sounds like he's really down on boxing. Well, I'm not down. I'm just not a huge follower. But the reason I write these books, I think all these fighters and these they deserve to be told. They deserve the credit. I can truthfully say this. I can't recall, certainly not out of the 60 world champions I've met, and any of them that I disliked. Some of the finest men I met in my life, and some of them, there was such a contradiction when I was learning about them. You see a fight, you go, Tony Zale, the Man of Steel, this guy, oh my God, one of the kindest, most gentlest men. And a lot of them that way, Jersey Joe Walcott and I became good friends. I was able to invite a lot of these guys to boxing dinners because of my bumping into them and meeting them, and then years later, someone said, hey, do you know any of these great fighters that maybe we could invite to our dinner in Rochester, New York? And I did. I got Tony Zale and Jimmy Bivens and Jimmy McLarnon, who I just loved. I spent a lot of time. Jimmy McLarnon, he's in that 50 years of fighters in friendships called Babyface Me. I was able to spend 10 years off and on going out to Los Angeles and spending time with him. That's from a different era, the 30s, McLarnon, born in Ireland, Canzaneri, Lou Ambers, all these guys, this boxing, I called them almost boxing royalty. It was such a different time, but all these guys, I met them and you go, my God, this guy did what? He's just like it was your father or just a dear friend that never think about them going into the ring and being involved in some horrific battles. Some of them,
yeah.
Some were really fancy Dan boxers, but I mean, some of them, oh my God. I remember meeting Charlie Burley, and then I was talking to Lloyd Marshall, and Lloyd, I think, might be the only guy that knocked Burley down. I think he knocked him down twice when they fought. And Lloyd said to me, so how is Charlie? And I said, well, I think he's slowing down. I said, of course, I never met him before, but his wife said, he says, well, it can't be from boxing. Now, at that time, I did not know he knocked Burley down twice. He said, it can't be from boxing. Nobody ever hit him. He was referring to his great boxing ability and the way he was able to avoid punches and all that. But that part of it, the history, I don't know if I'll ever stop. There's still a lot of stories to be told,
Yeah.
And
I agree.
the families, and when you meet the families, and some are sad stories and some aren't. Some are just, they didn't know any different. Dad went off to work. Only his job was getting in the ring and boxing,
Yeah.
To keep food on the table.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. That's a lot of the stories. A lot of the stories are that, to be honest. A lot of the old time stories. I think we did something on, we did a career profile on Barney Ross quite recently, and when you hear about the stories and you really dig deep into the archives of what the lives of these fighters were really like, or what you can only interpret as these fighters' lives were really like, it makes you sort of quite thankful to live in a completely different generation. I mean, you've lived through so many different generations. I've only lived through a few, and even looking at that now compared to what some of them went through is unbelievable. It's unreal to even think about, like, some of the things that they would have to go through. So
Oh yeah.
it's very, very interesting. And obviously Jimmy Bivens book in particular, the Johnny Risco book. These are fighters that are having their stories told to people that might not really know about them, and then it's giving them the opportunity to learn more about them, which is the beauty of it all, really, and which is why people do appreciate these types of biographical books on certain fighters from yesteryear, because, as you rightly pointed out at the very start of the conversation, you could go onto social media and you'll get many people that will claim certain fighter is the greatest of this era, but yet have they ever even seen this particular fighter fight? Because a lot of the time there isn't a lot of footage of them on these
No,
fighters from yesteryear.
the classic example is Harry Greb.
Yes, you just
Most people rate him as the greatest fighter of all time, and may have been, but there's no footage, so a lot of people are skeptical. They say, well, I can't even see him sparring. I can't, or even Charlie Burley. The only footage on him is his fight with Oakland Billy Smith, and it's a good thing to watch. Sadly, these fighters, Bivens an example, all these great fights, and the footage that is available was not his greatest fights. And Johnny Risco, I've never found any footage. Lloyd Marshall, when he's fighting Freddie Mills in 1947 in England, he's considered well past his prime, But when you watch that fight and see, how he rolled his shoulders and how he could hit you with a left hook and hit you with a right. I mean, how amazing he was even then. And I'm not saying, one fight makes a man, but it really impressed me. I'm so glad I was able to get that footage. The late Jim Jacobs, who had the biggest fight collection in the world, he had a contact in England. I forget who it was, but he got a lot of films out of there, including, for me, the Maxim Mills fight and the Marshall Mills fight. And the Joey Maxim, of course, who had a reputation, rightfully so, of not being a very big puncher. The irony is these British films are fantastic. They're beautifully done. But the Maxim Mills fight, Maxim actually knocks out Mills in the 10th round, and whoever was doing the video or the filming on this missed the knockdown. You see in the action, all of a sudden there's Freddie on the canvas. You don't see the punch. The one time that Maxim really, he knocked out a couple of Freddie's teeth. And it's not there. But that being said, yeah, it's hard. It's hard to, like Risco, I could only go by all the research we did. When I first started doing Cleveland things, there was some of the old timers around that knew Risco and had seen him fight, so you can go by that. But it's hard when there's not footage, guys like, all the modern ones, like Leonard and Hager and all. There's fight after fight after fight, and even Sugar, going back Sugar Ray Robinson and Basilio and Gavin, all there's footage, But some of these old timers like Greb and that, and even Burley and Bivens to a degree. I would give anything to see a fight of Bivens when he knocked out Ezra Charles or knocked down Ezra Charles numerous times and shellacked him, and when he beat all these champions. There's no footage, the footage of his fight in 1948 with Charles is good footage, and it's a close fight, but it's not prime time.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Jerry, you know what? It's been a pleasure. I obviously want to thank you for your time, because you spent a long time going through a lot of things for myself and for the people that listen and watch the episode that we put out, and it's been a pleasure. And I feel like you've only really scratched the surface of what's there and what you've experienced, and I'm pretty sure there'll be an opportunity in the future to revisit some of this in a different capacity, because I think there's so much.
And hopefully in the future, I let you talk a lot more.
Uh,
I was like this was my last interview ever, the way I was talking to her. But I'm very, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about it, And when people, I kind of, it's not that I don't mind having compliments and praise. It, I mean, if it's right, if it's truthful, but I always make a joke about it. It's kind of true in a way. People say, well, how come you know so much or whatever? And I go, because I'm old. you know, but I did live through a great time in boxing, really. I mean, to get a bit of a taste of it in the 50s and then go to the 60s, 70s, and 80s. That was some great boxing, I mean, people that lived in the 20s and 30s, that I'm sure those great fights were unbelievable, and especially back in the days when there was no television and people listened to their radio set to the Dempsey Carpentier fight or whoever, or these people that went like 100-some thousand people to watch, Dempsey and Tunney, and that's mind-boggling to think that you would be in a crowd like that, and people, you watch these old films that are available. It was a different world. People were dressed up in suits and hats, Now it's lucky they have pants on when they go,
Yeah, it's true. It is. It's very true. It is. It's one of them where you kind of love to have been able to. I'm quite envious of people like yourself, in respect of that you've been able to live through these particular eras, and it's people like me who get to come in at a certain point down the line, say, who's lived through, say, the late 80s, 90s, and obviously up to now. And then when you go into the depths of what's there available to you and you watch these fights, and I suppose I can only thank the Lord for things like YouTube, to be honest with you. For as much as absolute rubbish that goes onto YouTube, there's some absolute brilliant stuff when it relates to
absolutely
boxing.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I'm just like quite thankful that is available to people like myself, who's in his mid-30s, who's able to look at a lot of the stuff that is available to see there, because a lot of the stuff that people they have it in their own collection, and unless they put it into that public domain, it might never see the light of day. So we might never get to see the likes of some of these older fighters ever come to the forefront. So it's great when we've got people with experience who've lived through it, who are able to write about it, who are able to sort of document their time covering this type of stuff. And it's been a pleasure to have you on. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, and I look forward to doing a part 2. I'm sure there'll be many more stories to come. Thank you for obviously telling everybody about the books, and I'm pretty sure once they've had the opportunity to go through it, I'm pretty sure you'll definitely get some more orders for the Bivens book. I know that for sure, because there's a lot of Bivens fans out there that want to know a little bit more about it, and that's not already out there in the public domain. So it'll be great to get people sending it your way and getting them to read that book and finding out all this information that maybe they didn't already know, or some of these little stories that you was able to get from Jimmy himself, and that's the beauty of it all.
Yeah, that's right. When you get to know somebody like I knew him, and we be going to a boxing dinner or something, and usually most all the time by car, and he would open up a little bit, and tell me stuff, and it wasn't like being a reporter and going up to the guy, oh, what do you think about, he would just start talking, or we'd go to a dinner and he'd tell me stories, like we go. I'll tell you one more thing, and I let you go. But we give you an example of this. We're at a boxing dinner in Rochester, New York, and Sandy Sadler's there. And in fact, you'll see in one of the books there's a nice picture of Jimmy, Sandy, and myself. And things that you would never think about. You think about wins and losses, and things that happened during the fight and whatever. But Jimmy was at a training camp somewhere up in New York. And in that same training camp was Sandy Sadler. So they must have been training for a fight card up there, and so I guess it was kind of like a rustic kind of a place they were staying in, the quarters where they slept. And Jimmy maintained that Sandy found a snake outside and put it in his sleeping bag. So Jimmy, like a lot of people, maybe even more so, he wasn't afraid to get in the ring with Archie Moore 5 times, but he was, deathly afraid of snakes. screaming bloody murder. And of course, I guess Sandy was standing over on the side laughing like a hyena, you know. And he took his belt he claimed he took his belt out of his pants and went and whipped Sandy's butt like a child, you know. So we're at this dinner. Sandy Sadler was still in pretty good shape then. I guess he had the last few years he kind of faded, you know, mentally or whatever, but he was still pretty sharp there. We're getting ready to take this picture and we're talking. And I said, "Hey, Sandy, Jimmy tells me about this time he took a belt to you in the training camp because you put a snake in his sleeping bag." And he didn't deny it. In fact, he had kind of a weird grin on his face, kind of like almost busting out laughing. So I do believe it was true. But those are the kind of stories that would pop up with, you know, times you wouldn't even, you know, I ever tell you about the time? What? So it was you know, it was good times. He was a good man. He was very generous to my family and me. He would always invite us to dinners and things, you know. So I mean, when my son, who's 41, by the way, Mr. 30-something, he was born, and Jimmy lived clear east, quite a ways from me on the other side of Cleveland. And he and his wife came over, and they had all these gifts. They had never been to my house before at that time. I mean, things for babies, for, you know, just, it was unbelievable what they brought. Another time he came over to a cookout, a barbecue, and brought all, his wife said, "What can we bring?" And we said, "Nothing." And he brought all this meat, and he was cooking these ribs on the grill. And it was just the kind of guy he was. He was amazing. He was an amazing guy. But, you know, as a fighter, I'll tell you sometime, and I don't even want to do it on a podcast, but I'll tell you something on an email or something, a story about him in the Army, which is kind of a sad thing, but it'll explain a lot of things.
Yeah, so, no, that's absolutely shit. Save that one for a different time and not obviously on the interview. But I'll just wrap it up then and just say obviously thank you again for speaking to myself and obviously telling the story for myself and the listeners and the viewers. And it's been great to have you on, and I'm pretty sure you'll be back at some point in the future to tell us a few more little stories, a few more bits of information, and probably the next time we speak to you, we'll be hopefully talking about your new book.
Great. That sounds like fun.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.